Okay, welcome back. So today we're doing May-June 2024 question paper 12. Please note that question 4, 6 and 8 were removed from the paper. They were discounted due to errors in the questions. So we'll start at the bottom. You may notice that I've already put in some notes. That's because I started explaining my answers without realizing that I was recording the video. So please bear with me. Question 30. What is not included in the current account and the balance of payments? Foreign direct investment is not included. So it's a very common question. Remember, the current account and the balance of payments is made up of 4 different sectors. It's made up of the balance of trade in goods. It's made up of the balance of trade in services. It's made up of the primary income account and the secondary income account. So as you can see, A would be a component on the secondary income, and trade in goods and trade in services, they would be their own separate components. So they would be included as well in the current account. Question 29. What would increase the demand for US dollars? So for D, it actually decreased the demand for US dollars. The government would be looking to hold or exchange foreign currencies instead. For C, foreigners who live in the US sending money home to their relatives. That would actually increase the demand for their own currency, not US dollars. Foreign firms who are buying US firms is the most obvious increase in demand, because obviously what that means is that they would have to obtain US dollars in order to buy those US firms. And dividends paid from US firms to foreign shareholders, they could be paid in US dollars to those shareholders anyway, which would not necessarily increase the demand for those US dollars. 28. Remember, terms of trade is the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices. Therefore, it has nothing to do with the dependence on imports, the competitiveness of its exports only, or the relative strength of the currency in the foreign exchange market. It is purely the purchasing power of its exports relative to its imports, as denoted by the formula that we use to calculate terms of trade that I've provided in here. Question 27, comparative and absolute advantage. Just to stress what I was writing in here, absolute advantage is the country that very simply has the highest output. Comparative advantage is the country that has the lowest opportunity cost. So when we went through this, what we calculated was country X has absolute advantage in cotton is false. We can see country Y can produce 500 units, country X can only produce 3. Country X has comparative advantage in butter. When we calculate for country X, 1 butter here equals 1.57 units of cotton to be given up, whereas for country Y, 1 butter equals 2.5 units of cotton to be given up. So that is the correct answer. They do have a lower opportunity cost of producing butter. C would therefore have to be wrong. They don't have a comparative advantage in both goods, and no gains from trade is not true, as long as they have a comparative advantage and specialise in that particular good for each of their countries, and as long as they trade in between what lies their opportunity cost, they will benefit from international trade. But we have no information on that from the diagram, so we can't conclude it from that diagram either. Question 26. This was about a primary income deficit, which we said is a component on the current account, and the deficit is increased. So for A, increasing the value of imported medical supplies is part of the balance of trade in goods that we talked about already. That's a separate component, so it doesn't affect the primary income account. An increase in investment dividends paid out to foreigners, so that's money that's leaving the country. It's an outflow. Essentially, which means that it would help to increase the deficit on the primary account, because that is where investment dividends are included. Reduction in the value of exported manufactured goods, again, is part of the balance of trade of goods and nothing to do with the primary account. And a reduction in expenditure by visiting tourists is part of the balance of trade in services, and again, nothing to do with the primary income account. Okay, question 25. We're asked about which policy would have the least impact from protecting our domestic textile industry. A would be an embargo, banning the import of textiles, which would have an impact. It would help to increase consumption on the domestic market for textiles. If we increased the indirect tax or the sales tax on textiles sold in the country, that would have the least impact on imports because it would actually make imports more price competitive as they're becoming more expensive domestically. Tariff on the import of textiles would have an impact as well because it would raise the price of the imports, which would make them less competitive in comparison to the domestic market. And then all textiles sold in the country is what we have here known as an administrative burden or artificially high quality standards. And they are another form of protectionism that we use in order to make it harder for imports to come in and for more to be directed towards the domestic industry instead. Okay, and for 24 we said we simplify it by making, we're trying to reduce a balance of payment deficit, so we're trying to get the exports to rise and the imports to go down. We explained that a reduction in subsidies to domestic industry would reduce our exports, so obviously that would not help to reduce it. Reducing indirect taxes would increase the level of imports as people have more disposable income. Increase in the exchange rate would make our imports rise because the price of imports would go down. The price of exports would rise and therefore our total exports would go down, which would again counteract what we're trying to achieve. And then we said the correct answer is an increase in the interest rates. It's what's left over. Now the reason why in particular is because an increase in the interest rates helps to finance a budget deficit, which you may have seen in previous questions. An increase in the interest rates, what that does is it may allow us to attract foreign investment. It can make our assets more attractive to foreign investors, and that means they can earn a higher return on their investments compared to other countries that might have lower interest rates. So it's essentially going to be an inflow of foreign capital or an inflow of investment essentially, and that will allow us to reduce the balance of payments deficit, or to finance it in particular, which will allow us to reduce it. Okay, question 23. Which combination of problems would be most likely to cause a country's government to reduce taxation and to lower interest rates? So what they'd be doing here is they'd be following an expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policy. And that would be designed to move aggregate demand to the right and to stimulate growth. Okay, so demand pull inflation, definitely not, because it would help to reduce demand pull inflation. Sorry, it would help to increase demand pull inflation because they are expansionary. High unemployment and a balance of payment current account deficit. So high unemployment definitely would be a problem that they would try and address by using the expansionary policy, because by moving AD to the right we can increase real GDP and we can therefore also increase our level of employment. But if a balance of payment current account deficit, however, we'd be trying to reduce the deficit, so we'd be trying to increase our exports. By moving AD to the right, there's the risk, unless we're directly addressing imports and exports, then we wouldn't actually allow, or we wouldn't be making a difference on the current account. We might actually increase the deficit as national income rises and people start to import more goods from the increase in real GDP. So therefore, the one that directly correlates with, for example, high unemployment, we could say reduced taxation could be used to incentivize them to come in and increase levels of employment. Lower interest rates, what that does is it makes borrowing more attractive. So therefore, if we have a problem of low levels of investment, the increased level of borrowing by both firms and consumers should allow us to address this low level of investment by lowering the interest rates. Question 22. How does the government use its central bank to promote an expansionary monetary policy? Okay, so this might be straightforward. For some people, it might not be for others, because really in reality, it's actually an IG question that they're assuming you have the knowledge of. So it's about the role of the central bank, essentially. Now, increasing interest rates for commercial banks. Okay, they have a role in the interest rates, but they don't actually increase the rates for the commercial banks, right? They're more of a regulator for those commercial banks, and they'll offer advice on what the interest rate changes should be based on what the government will tell them to do and what expansionary policy they're trying to follow. But remember that they don't actually lend to the commercial banks. They offer advice on changes for the interest rates, and therefore the commercial bank will change the interest rates for consumers that are actually borrowing from them. Increasing the interest rate on national debt, definitely not. Restricting bank credit for consumer durables, again, definitely not. We're looking for expansionary policy. What they will do is they will control the money supply, which is issuing notes and coins in circulation, and by increasing the money supply, they are following an expansionary monetary policy. Okay, also please remember that increasing interest rates is not an expansionary policy, it is a contractionary policy. Okay, very simple. Government decreases money supply. We're at equilibrium of X. Decreasing money supply is contractionary monetary policy. So if you can answer 22, you can answer 21. AD will shift left and will be left at point D. Very simple. What is true about a government's macroeconomic objectives? Economic growth ensures a more even distribution of income. That is not true. Can happen, but can also not happen. Might be more unequal. Increasing output ensures that more workers are employed. Again, not necessarily true. Might have a higher level of output, but it might be because productivity is increased, for example. Choosing between macroeconomic objectives requires a normative decision. That is true. So we know that there's conflicts between the macroeconomic objectives of governments. So therefore, they require an opinion or a subjective decision on which policy would be best, because essentially the difficulty in having policies where they don't overlap with each other and end up causing conflicts between all of their different macroeconomic aims is highly unlikely that they can find a policy which will do all. So they need to make subjective opinions based on what they want to follow at that time. And a stable rate of inflation means zero inflation is required. That's not true. We know that governments aim for an inflation rate of approximately, most anyway, somewhere between 2 and 4%, because it means that output is growing and hopefully real GDP will be rising slowly in that period. Question 19. What is the difference between GDP and GNI? Okay, GDP, gross domestic product. GNI, gross national income. Remember that the difference is relating to the factors of production, essentially, right? So payments to factors of production to residents of our country. GDP is essentially taking the total output for everything that is produced in that country, irregardless of whether they're produced from companies that are registered in our country or companies that are foreign. Whereas for GNI, we're taking out all of the payments to the factors of production for foreign entities, and we're adding back in all of our citizens who are earning payments to factors of production in foreign countries. So essentially the difference is what we term it is called its net property income from abroad and the compensation of employees. Okay, compensation, you know, is a payment of employees, so therefore the factor that explains the difference is the salaries remitted by those working abroad to their home accounts. Question 18. What change affecting an economy's labour force will cause an increase in economic growth in the short run? Okay, so it's got to be immediate. An increase in students entering university, that will be long run because it takes time for them to acquire the education and the skills to become more productive. Increase in the birth rate, again, that could be long run through an increase in the labour force eventually, about 25 years from now, whenever they actually start to enter the labour force. Immigration of skilled labour, that will definitely be immediate, right? Because they come into the country, they're available and they're ready to work. So our labour force could increase immediately. And increase in school leaving age, again, will be long run through the increase in productivity, education and skills they'll acquire, but they only acquire them over a long period of time. Question 17, what causes a rise in cost push inflation? Remember, cost push inflation is aggregate supply moving left. Fall in the rate of income tax, definitely not. That is designed to move AD right. And it may also move AS right, depending on if it's used as a supply side policy. Rise in the rate of income tax will move AD left. Appreciation of exchange rate will move AD left. Okay, now this is a tricky enough question because the answer is C. Depreciation of exchange rate can be two types of policies, right? It can be an expansionary monetary policy, which is designed to move AD to the right, and that is through decreasing price of exports. So price of exports go down. The total exports therefore will rise. The price of imports go up and the total imports will come down because of that. So essentially what this does is, now they probably should have clarified more information here, but essentially when we have a depreciation, it can also cause not just a shift to the right in AD, but it can also cause aggregate supply to shift to the left and cost push inflation. And that's because the price of the imports are rising. So if we have to import, for example, important raw materials, then what it does is it increases the cost of production for domestic firms who have to import those raw materials. And we know that cost push inflation is caused by increases in the cost of production. So as they increase the price of importing them, they still have to import them, and therefore their cost of production will rise and domestic inflation will be increased through cost push inflation. Okay, question 16. The table gives the value of a price index of an economy in 2 years. What could be concluded? So nothing about nominal income or real income. We're only given the price index figure, right? We're not given wage changes, for example. Standard of living is not indicated through price index either. So the only one that's left, and that makes sense, is the cost of living doubled. Why? Because we can see the price index has doubled, which means that goods and services has become twice as expensive, which therefore means that the cost of living in that country has become 2 times as expensive as it was last year. Question 15. Which government policy will increase AD? So we're looking for an expansionary policy. Raising indirect taxes definitely won't. It might move AD left through reducing consumer expenditure. Reducing the budget surplus, now that actually will, because if you think about it, reducing the budget surplus means that government expenditure has to go up and government revenue has to come down. So they'll be following an expansionary fiscal policy, right? Where they will be, for example, taxes will go down and government spending will rise, and then aggregate demand will move to the right. Okay, taxes down means that government revenue goes down from the budget surplus there, and then government spending goes up means that government expenditure obviously rises, and that causes AD to move to the right. So removing import quotas will not increase AD, it will make us have more imports. X minus M as our component of AD, our exports minus our imports, will drop, and then aggregate demand will shift left, not right, and then removing domestic subsidies could have the same effect, right? It might make them less price competitive and we might have less consumption due to the increase in price. AD might move left from the consumption standpoint. Okay, 14. Diagram shows an initial market equilibrium for an agricultural product of $6 and 800 units. How much will the government have to spend to increase the market price to $10? Very simple. They'll have to spend the market price multiplied by the quantity, right? So they'll have to spend this line in here essentially, which is 10 multiplied by 400. So they will therefore have to spend $4,000 to do so. Okay, question 13. What is an example of a public good? Now remember, in the exam they will often give you the same examples for public goods, such as, for example, national defence, which we can see here is provided as one. Flood defences is another one that is often mentioned. Could be a lighthouse, for example. Might be another one as well. Okay, so a new road linking a major city with a port, that is not non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Free lunches provided to students at a school, again, it is not non-rivalrous and non-excludable, therefore it does not make it a public good. Wi-Fi access is not non-excludable and non-rivalrous. State provision of a national defence system, however, is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Okay, question 12. A market is in equilibrium. The government intervenes by creating a price floor, aka a minimum price. Remember, minimum price is aka price floor, maximum price is price ceiling. Oh, that's the question. So that would be B. Remember, minimum price has to be placed above the current market equilibrium. For it to be effective. So minimum price would look something like this. Maximum price would be below, and we call that a price ceiling. Okay, question 11. Which reason for the increase in demand for a smartphone is an example of joint demand? So remember, joint demand is where essentially they're like complements, right? So they're going to be they're two different goods that are going to be consumed together. So it's nothing to do with a fall in its price or a rise in the price of a substitute. That's definitely not a complement, right? Fall in the price of parts used to make a smartphone, that could be to do with joint supply, for example, but it's not a separate good, right? It's a part that is used to actually make it. But a fall in the price of connecting to a network, the network would be the complementary relationship with the smartphone. Okay, so therefore we will demand the network at the same time or the same rate as we would demand the smartphones, essentially. Question 10, consumer surplus, P1 to P2. Remember, definition of consumer surplus, it is the area above equilibrium price to the top of the demand curve. Okay, straightforward. So if we move from P1 to P2, before we move, our consumer surplus is this area in here. After we move, the consumer surplus is this area because it's just like the definition, above price, top of the demand curve. So what area represents consumer surplus after price change? We can see that would be P2 or S. And then this area represents, just for a bit of extra knowledge, what we would call the loss of consumer surplus from the change in the price. Question 9. In Asia, instant noodles are an inferior good because dried fruit is a better quality substitute. Okay, I'm not really sure about that one, Cambridge. The diagram shows the demand for instant noodles. What would have caused the shift in the demand curve for instant noodles from D1 to D2? Okay, so we know they're an inferior good and we have an increase in the demand. So what we need to see is essentially, if there's a fall in the price of dried fruit, what would that do? That would still move the demand for dried fruit to increase, and because there is substitute, the demand for instant noodles would drop, right? So we would expect a demand curve to shift to the left, not to the right in that case. A rise in real income. Now, inferior goods have the opposite relationship, right? So when income goes up, the demand for inferior goods actually goes down. So if we had a rise in real income, we would expect the demand for that inferior good to drop. A rise in unemployment, however, would result in income levels coming down, right? And if the income levels come down, that's when we would expect the demand for the inferior good to increase. As people have less disposable income available, they buy the cheaper, poorer quality product like these instant noodles. So finally, successful advertising campaign by dried fruit producers. Again, that would increase demand for dried fruit, and therefore it would decrease demand for the instant noodles, which is the opposite of what we're looking at. Okay, question 7. I've covered these types of questions a lot before. What happens? Price elasticity of supply for the product. So first of all, straight away you can see the price elasticity will be unchanged, and that's because both of the curves are straight line curves that come out of the point of origin, and every time that happens it means that the PES value is unitary. Okay, it is 1.00 at every point along these curves. Okay, so even if the supply curve moves, it doesn't affect it. It's 1.00 at all points as long as it comes out of this point of origin, and as long as it is a straight line. Remember, in other papers we have seen before, sometimes it can come out of origin and it can look like this. That's a bad example. Let me draw that again. And in that case, when it's wavy, for example, then the elasticity will change along different points. But as long as it is a straight line, like so, and comes out of point of origin, it will be unitary at all points. So the producer surplus then is the area, just like it's the opposite of consumer surplus, right? It is the area below equilibrium price to the bottom of the supply curve. Okay, so in this instance, I'll move this down here for a little bit, we can show the producer surplus before and after. So before we have the shift, The producer surplus is this area in here that I'm shading, area below equilibrium price to the bottom of the supply. And then when we have the shift, the producer surplus becomes a much larger area here, which we can now see the full area encased in orange. Therefore, the producer surplus would increase and the price elasticity of supply would remain unchanged. Okay, question 5. Share of total incomes from profit in a country shows more variation over time than incomes from interest, rent and wages. What is the most likely reason for this? Okay, so we're only looking at what addresses the question. Interest rates has nothing to do with it. Wages has nothing to do with it. It's very simply because profit is what is left after interest, rent and wages are subtracted from total income. So what we're essentially saying is that profit is more variable than these other ones. And it makes sense about if you think about it just in terms of a regular business, right? A regular business is going to pay wages at a set rate over a period of 12 months. They're going to pay rent at a set rate over a period of 12 months. They're going to pay interest at a set rate over a period of 12 months. But the business's profit will be depending on the demand, their revenue they're taking in, their costs at that particular time, and all of that stuff is a lot more variable than what they will actually be receiving from interest, rent and wages that are more likely to be set and fixed over a period of time. Question 3. Earth observation satellites designed to acquire information are close to the theoretical case of a public good. In 2011, the World Meteorological Organization estimated that improving satellite observations would cost an extra $1 billion a year. What is a normative statement? So we're looking for a subjective opinion-based statement about Earth observation satellites. Estimated cost of improving satellites is $1 billion. That's a positive statement. We can see that in the text. Information received from the satellites is non-rival. True. Information has to be non-rivalrous because us being able to consume that information does not reduce the availability of that information for other people. Satellites are designed to acquire best possible information on climate change. That is also true based on what we've been told. It's a positive statement or a hypothesis that we can check or test. But responsibility for the cost should be shared by all governments. The language, again, is what makes it a normative statement. It's what makes it an opinion, subjective-based statement. Okay, and what is produced in a mixed economy but not in a free market economy? Very simple, public goods. Demerit goods would be. Free goods would not be produced anyway, but they have no opportunity cost or factors of production involved, and private goods would be. Public goods, non-excludable and non-rivalrous, and hence the reason why they're not provided in a free market economy, because the private companies in these free market economies cannot obtain any profit from them because of their non-excludable and non-rivalrous nature, which makes them not want to produce them. Final question. PPC curve, we've got a point X. Very simple. Remember, any point on the curve, if I labelled a point here A, for example, that would represent an efficient allocation of resources. It would mean, if I'm using an AS curve to describe it, for example, it would mean that I have no spare capacity. So I would be at 0.3 in my Keynesian curve, for example, right? Now, if I have a point outside the PPC, it means that there's scarcity available. Essentially, I do not have enough factors of production available to make that level of output. Not unless in the future I can shift my PPC like so, and I can obtain more factors of production to make that level of output. But unless I do that, any point outside of my PPC is currently unattainable. So it's nothing to do with capital consumer goods ratio. Increasing levels of unemployment would be moving from, for example, point A to point B. It would be moving from being efficient to inefficient, and therefore in the Keynesian curve we would move to stage 2 or stage 1 here, which is where we have more spare capacity available in the economy, and too many consumer goods are causing a fall in economic growth. Again, that's nothing to do with point X being outside of the curve. Okay, and that's the last paper for 2024 done.